Moving back a bit in history and in time, if we do look questions that might puzzle, especially the younger generations, who keep asking around when they hear about communism, what was the attraction? What led so many people to dedicate their lives to the cause, some of them dying for the cause of communism?
Well, there's no getting away from the fact that a lot of people joined the Communist Party in many countries for the most idealistic reasons. Once the Communist Party was in power, joining the party meant you improved your career prospects. But that was very far from being the case in an authoritarian right-wing regime. You were much more likely to be imprisoned, exiled, or killed. And even in a democratic country, joining the Communist Party could lead to some social isolation. So you had to have some deep beliefs, and many people believed that they were going to build a fairer society, a just society, get rid of the gross inequalities and injustices of capitalism. Of course, the trouble is, once they joined the party, then they had to go along with whatever was the Soviet line, and they soon found themselves making all sorts of compromises. But the initial joining of the party was often from the purest of motives.
Outside the countries, outside the communist countries, the intelligentsia admired the system for quite a while, even when stories were coming out of strong repression, the gulags in the Soviet Union, strong censorship, the monopoly of power, the mistreatment of people, the inefficiency of the economy. Still, there was a reluctance to believe those facts. Why do you think the West, to call it that way, was so reluctant to accept what was happening?
It varied from country to country. That for many intellectuals, Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, when he denounced some of the crimes of Stalin, was an eye-opener, and a lot of people left the Communist Party and became more anti-communist. In France, for example, it wasn't until Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, was published in the 1970s that French intellectuals stopped believing in the Soviet Union, and a lot of them became ultra-critical. So it was quite curious that the way in which intellectuals refused to look at the evidence when it was already available until very late in the day.
That kind of reminds of another Marxist, in this case, Groucho Marx, who said that, who do you want to believe, me or the evidence in front of your eyes?
Yeah.
It seems to be that case. They didn't want to believe the evidence in front of their eyes.
That's right, yes. And that worked, the Groucho Marx remark worked for Gorbachev, because he said that what he saw with his own eyes when he came to the West for the first time, when he visited Western Europe, Italy, France, that was when he realized the gulf between Soviet propaganda and what life was actually like in Western Europe.
Criticism of what was happening in the communist countries was to play the game of the right wing, or to play the game of the imperialists, of the Washington. And that argument seemed to hold water for quite a while, didn't it?
It did, but it was always possible to be critical of American foreign policy and many aspects of the United States, and be critical of the Soviet Union as well. After all, in Western Europe, over many years, the main alternative to communism, especially the main appeal to working class voters, was that of social democratic parties. And in many countries, Scandinavia, certainly Britain, West Germany, socialists of a social democratic type were far more popular than the communists. So this was an alternative that was neither the system of the United States or unquestioning support for American foreign policy, nor was it being uncritical of the Soviet Union. So there were alternatives. It's not an either-or.
We do see still a lot of the old type of resistance along those lines in Latin America, for instance, in relation to Cuba, where a substantial segment of the intelligentsia or the left refuses to accept criticism of Cuba beyond the obvious, oh, the country has economic problems. So the existence of a common, clear enemy, it's continuously an argument to defend the system.
Yes, and this was especially so during the Cold War. I mean, Cuba, of course, has got its achievements, not least in its health service, But why that should lead one to defend authoritarian rule is another question. And you know, I would come back to the view that Cuba could have preserved some of its achievements, but also liberalized the system quite a bit, but for the counterproductive attitude of successive United States administrations.
Putting aside the distortions that specific countries apply to their own model of communism as they integrate it into their own system, to what extent do you think that the seeds of destructions were already there in Marxism and Leninism?
I think that the seeds of destruction were there in Marxism and Leninism. Neither Marx nor Lenin seriously had a theory of political institutions. They didn't think about how accountability of politicians was necessary. I mean, they didn't think they were utopians, but they were utopians as well. They believed in this classless society of the future, full communism, in which everybody would somehow happily cooperate. But there was no consideration of how you would hold people to account, no interest in things like checks and balances or independent judiciary. So these faults were there from the very beginning in Marxism-Leninism. I think the systems also had the seeds of their own destruction in the sense that the educated people, a lot of these countries when they became communist were overwhelmingly peasant, overwhelmingly illiterate, and yet gradually the populations became better educated. And the more educated they became, the less satisfied they were with the censorship, not being able to read what books they wanted to read, not being able to see the films they wanted to see, not being able to travel abroad. So in that sense too, the systems contained the seeds of their own destruction.
Professor Brown, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Se você quiser mais detalhes desta entrevista, acesse o blog do Milenio no site da Globo News.